Welcome back, everybody. Scott Stevens here as we take a look at the weather. Stateside, it has been just absolutely crazy. These derecho events that you've heard that word, or maybe the word is completely new and not familiar to you, but it is essentially the description of a line of thunderstorms upon which there is a lot of downward momentum of wind. The winds are very strong just off the surface, and in this particular instance, we'll see how when that wind, those violent winds, actually come down and reach the surface, what kind of damage can be a result. Usually, we see hurricanes in that downward momentum of all those winds. And in this particular instance, it was called a tsunami, where there was literally a pulse of a pressure wave associated with these thunderstorms in one location in around, I believe it was Cedar Rapids, Iowa, recording what was a 6 millibar change, literally an undulation in the pressure of the atmosphere. All right, we'll come over here, and this is where we started yesterday, as the event was already underway when we talked with you last evening. Good evening, Jane. A little safer here in Colorado, at least for the time being, as these winds were approaching Chicagoland, middle Ohio. We had already seen some of this damage happening in Iowa, and we've already got some satellite pictures of the damage from Iowa. And it is in many, many ways heartbreaking. From Jim Cantore, close to 500 reports of strong winds and hail. Most of these blue are wind reports with high winds, and several of them is where we ended up with winds at or above 100 miles per hour. And when you deal this kind of humorous, but how do you evacuate people from, a care center? I guess you do it with your Suburban and a flatbed trailer. I just thought, you never know. You wonder, you're taking the people to safety, but how is that accomplished? But that was Oklahoma. Now, Shane Brown created this GIF showing how the storm started in southern South Dakota, and then traversed the better part of 700 miles, and at times upwards of 70 miles per hour as it raced towards the southeast at a very rapid clip. And the Twitter sphere and photos are just literally all over social media with this kind of imagery, with this shelf cloud as the beast approaches. And whenever storms end up with this kind of intensity, there's always some amazing geometry that shows up. And this was Lookout Chicago. These storms have produced winds up to 112 miles per hour, and this was the loop through last midnight as it began to finally wind down as it hit the Bluegrass State and then into West Virginia and then falling apart deeper into Missouri. But in some ways, it kind of regenerated later on this afternoon. We'll see if we can't get in here. Des Moines, Iowa, I believe this is, where we see widespread greater than 130 mile per hour winds, just at less than a kilometer above the ground or about 2,000 feet. 141 miles an hour was the max return. So what the radar does is it sends two pulses out. Well, it says more than that. We'll just say an outgoing wave and then the incoming reflection. And just like the highway patrol officer who's using Doppler radar to scan you, the radar is doing that thousands and thousands of times as it hears the how do I say it, the symphony of the storm. It hears all of the rain droplets, and then assembles the math and understands which pulse went out. It's identified, and then here's the echo back. And it's really a beautiful system in how it works and the data that it's able to provide us in near real time. And this would not be possible without the incredible mathematics and the processing capabilities. But outside of Chicago, winds so strong as it begins to peel off the roof of either apartment complex or a multi-use project. But nonetheless, that's what happens when all of a sudden you're hammered with 80, 90, what are essentially Category 1 to Category 3 hurricane type wind speeds. All right, let's continue on. We just happen to be at the 20th anniversary of the space station, and the United States gratefully now has the ability to get man back into space after that program was aggressively dismantled over the last 15 years. Here's what it looked like from that from the radars. It can see the strong winds pushing ahead, how the top of the storm's coming in first, driven by those stronger upper level winds, and then the lower level winds and the rains and the thunderstorms, or the thunder approaches somewhat later. So you can always see it coming in up above first. That's where the winds are strongest, and those strong winds are perpetuated down to the surface. And you can see that indicated there with the red coloring. You're watching you at your salon. Oh, Risa, good to see you and have you on board. All right, Scranton, Iowa, and this is what it looks like after 100-mile-an-hour winds have gone through in mid-August with a corn crop that has already, got their cobs on. The corn is deep into the maturing stage, and what do? So many of these farmers now don't have cattle that they can come in and then graze this, because the probability that the stalks being able to right themselves to the point where the combines can come in, the harvesting can come in and then cut the stalk at an appropriate height to be able to pull in the cob and then harvest the kernel, it's just not likely to happen. You can see a 7-8 foot tall corn there, one that just was able to withstand it. And this is what I'm talking about. And there's a Savoy Institute who really has done a lot for regenerative agriculture. And there's a movement today to try to ban the meat eating, but there is a way that these herbivores, remember the American West was the most productive when it had the bison, when it was grazed, when the food, the biological material was processed by the next higher life form. And that is what the farmers are missing right now, because most of them are just one-trick ponies. All they've got are the combines to handle the harvest. They don't have the nearby livestock to now deal with what is essentially a downed crop. And what this farmer is doing is holding these cattle in a pen so that they defecate, they urinate on top of the soil after it has just been harvested, or the grasses, because this really began in Africa and has spread globally, this intensive harvesting. Because if you just let the animals loose, they're going to wander off, and you don't get the soil churned over. You don't get the animal waste matter then turned back in the soil, and that is the key aspect of this. This imagery is repeated over and over and over through Iowa and through Illinois, and sitting out there stands the grains. The grain that was to go to market, and then the resources then to end up in the farmer's pocket. So a meteor tsunami, when we go on in there, have a look at this. It actually, the term actually exists. Peak wind gusts with the derecho so far 106 miles per hour at LeGrand, Iowa, 99 at Albion, Iowa, 95 at Marshalltown, Iowa. Iowa hit very, very hard as this thing moved that 770 miles. And this is what it looks like when you're in the storm, just the relentless winds. It's almost a minimum of 15 minutes because this event was so particularly large. And then you end up with the flying objects. And this is why they used to recommend people end up in bathtubs to protect themselves from tornadoes, is because of this kind of flying debris. There was a time when our bathtubs were actually cast iron. Now they're fiberglass. And I don't know, and I would venture to say that they will not and cannot, they physically cannot provide the protection that the older technology would, because you can see how deeply these kind of projectiles, these 2x4s, can then move through a house. And even the lawn chair becomes a weapon when it is driven by 100-mile-per-hour winds. And there was a post where a guy showed his video and essentially saying that after 15 minutes I've lost 2/3 of my trees. They're just gone. And even some of the lobby windows and some of the higher up windows have been lost by this storm. And it just becomes relentless, and there's really no way to know just how bad it can get and how quickly. All right, this is, sometimes when you can't really assess how deep the water is, somebody else has got to show the way, and this person over here decided not to go around it or to try to go around it. And anyway, it looks like this is, well, I guess it is a rain event. I was wondering if it wasn't just a blown pipeline underneath. So one of these is actually animated. This is the one I want to see if I can't pull up. But what we can see in this highlighted area, how does it look over there? Yeah, that looks okay for you guys. That you can see that this is all of the square miles that were blown down because of this wind event. All of that, where we have a little bit of a lighter color. And within the next week, as some of the crop either recovers or the stalks are broken and the root ball is not able to sustain the foliage that's up above. That will get a further discoloration in the satellite imagery, and I'll continue to share that with you as the story unfolds and we begin to understand what just happened. An undular boar as it passed over our office this morning. This down in Birmingham, Alabama. Those are kind of cool. But what I'm interested in is all these other patterns that are up here. All these other different wavelengths, these other waves that have to have some kind of genesis, some pulse, some drop in the pond to set in motion those waves. And those, when you begin to throw time lapse up at the sky and then do an interval of, say, every 5 seconds, it really becomes interesting what you can understand how our weather is created, if you will, because those kind of events propagate, sustain, tear apart those kind of thunderstorms. All right, and one last one. And I know we've talked a lot about what's happened in China, a lot about the flooding, a lot of the displacement, the grave risk, the utterly grave risk that those people downstream of the Three Gorges Dam still are under. That story has not been told yet, but this is a tornado in Inner Mongolia. Now, outside of where the flooding is happening in China, they've been dealing with a drought. It truly as if we've drawn a line between the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots in northwest China and into Inner Mongolia have lost their wheat crop for the year. It's gone. It's too late to reharvest or to replant and then harvest once again. And the same story with China and their flooding, to where they typically will have 3 seasons for rice. Plant in March and April, harvest in June. And then plant in May and June, harvest in August, and then plant in June and July, and then harvest in October. So they have 3 times that they can roll a crop through those farmlands. And the June, July, and now August flooding has completely taken away their ability to harvest a crop. So looking for a hurricane, Elida, expected to form in the eastern Pacific tonight, and it appears like it'll stay far enough away from those kind of lands. This was the flooding in New South Wales, and then India continues to be impacted by flooding because the reason that China is flooding, that those same conditions continue to progress eastbound across the Asian continent. So India has been deeply susceptible to a continuation of the floodings, and there are literally tens of millions that have been impacted by that. All right, Eastern Pacific, that is the biggest gal out there. Like we can identify sex with these things, but we do nonetheless with naming. Maximum sustained winds at 85 knots or 100 miles per hour with minimum central pressure at about 975. So that's a decent little event. The Atlantic, a little quieter. We've got 11 out there. It's enough to have garnered a name, and we will see where tropical depression heads, but more than likely to the east. Right now, sustained winds at 30 as it moves towards the west at about 16 miles per hour. All right, let's pop back to Australia. Kind of terrifying, isn't it, Robin? It makes you grateful that you've got these kind of mountains around us and that we're relatively dry. So almost at worst, we can experience in the mountains of the U.S. West are the monsoon thunderstorms. And they kind of come and go terribly quickly. They rarely go up and then remain stationary. It happens. I've even seen that happen with other storms, moving on through, and you'll wonder, why is that one single storm standing still? And for that, we don't have explanations other than, hey, it's the weather. Blank happens. And it does happen. All right, I'll globally loop this thing. Southern Australia, contending with another winter-like event, and then another one will happen towards the early part of next week and through the middle of next week, and they could use the water. There has been some flooding, but nonetheless, it tends to be a dry place, so let's soak it up. Very chilly air expected towards the latter part of next week. Right now, Western Europe kind of on the warm side up here in the far northwest corner of the map. I'd stand in front of it if I could, because I'm really good at the green screen, and I'd really like to do that for you. But lots of northern Asia going to remain on the chilly side for the next week or two. Back stateside, hot in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, much of interior California, coastal areas. Very nice, 60s and 70s, and you can understand why People gravitate to the coast and on those cliffs because then they can enjoy the cooling effects of the Pacific this time of year, and the cool air all the way up into Vancouver Island with 50s and 60s even at mid-afternoon. And then the east, rather wet through the Great Lakes states as they've had a high pressure that has kind of settled in. I'll pop over here first. Here's the highs hitting across the lakes. So zoom in and see dew points. Can you guys see that? It looks like you can. In the 50s, which is glorious. Glorious for August, with temperatures in the 70s and it looks like in mid-80s and mid to late afternoon in August. That's just nice. And the moisture not too far away that we can't get a return flow and a do-over with additional thunderstorms. That's definitely in the cards. And again, they've erupted on the high plains of Colorado, now moving into Kansas, just like they have the last couple of nights, and even into western or the northern portions of the Sierra in California and of western Nevada. Some thunderstorms are erupting, but also dealing with fires. Here's a plume right here, far northwest California, Eureka, but inland, obviously, because we're in the forest, with a plume, and then another one right into here, into just outside of Grand Junction, Colorado. There we go. There's that one that continues to go. So there's fires out west, and we've had, I would have to say, a very mediocre monsoon season. Very, very mediocre. This is going to leave us susceptible to just the expansion of the drought as the monsoon winds down. As we end August, typically by the first week of September, it's nearly done, except for maybe El Paso, possibly as far north as Albuquerque and Phoenix, but that's shutting down. And then the derecho event progressing southward, but not nearly as strong, just not even nearly close to the event that it was yesterday, with these more widely scattered, much slower moving thunderstorms. Looks like my camera was unplugged. Bring it back, Scott, please bring it back. So, yeah, three things to look at. The screen that I'm looking at that is projected over here where, well, you are, and then over here is kind of like the command and control center. So a couple of things happening there. All right, so where we are, let's just go to the records. Record temperatures tomorrow, heat in the northeast. Also El Paso, Denver, Binghamton, New York at 88 degrees, and Alamosa at 87 degrees, within a degree of a record. So there's some record highs come tomorrow, and then even to Wednesday, mostly in the high plains, and then in the interior and central and southern Rockies for the hot temperature. All right, guys, so that's kind of where we are. There's a big part of the story with this derecho event that happened yesterday has yet to be told. We've got to do some forensics, and then the farm inspectors have got to go out and just ascertain the kind of damage. But it will undoubtedly, in one way or another, and probably more than one way, impact food supplies through the winter and into next year, whether it's seed, whether it's silage for the cattle, whether it's, it's corn. We've grown accustomed to using it for just about everything in this country. Whether it's good for you or not, corn is the staple, and soybeans are not that far behind. All right, thanks for stopping by. Good to see you guys hanging in there, and we'll catch you tomorrow. Going to talk about food security on Another Perspective tomorrow at 6 o'clock Mountain. It's an important issue. It really is, outside of grabbing some physical currency or some currency that is outside the system, because apparently modern monetary theory is in full bore, which means we're just going to print and print and print and print, and so inflation is an inevitable thing. So outside of getting maybe a digital currency or some gold and silver, food is going to be the other thing you really, really want to have your hands on. All right, have a great evening, guys, and as always, keep looking up. Oh, do that because the Perseid meteor shower tonight and tomorrow going to be at its peak outside, kind of away from city lights. But the Perseids have been one of my favorite events, being the amateur astronomer that I am. But have a look at the Perseids. All right, have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow.